Today, you are going to be learning about LGBTQ plus community legal needs under COVID-19. We are so excited for the amazing turnout for this webinar. So thank you all for being here. We also see that there's really wonderful representation from our civil legal aid providers, from our state agencies, from our private law firms. And so we are just really grateful to all of you for being here. We also have some great community members and non-lawyers joining us. And so we are just really happy to have all of you here today. Al and I will be doing presentation. We'll introduce ourselves in just a second, but I do encourage you to use the chat as we move through to ask questions, and then we will have an open Q&A period for the end of the section or for the end of the conversation. So the subtitle for this conversation is Systemic Discrimination Got Us Here, Survival and Resilience Networks Will Get Us Out. So that should give you a little bit of a preview of how we approach these topics, that LGBTQ communities, and particularly Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, queer and trans communities, we have a long history of community networks and mutual aid networks that we rely on. And so we'll be weaving all of that information together today. Al, can you push us to the second slide, please? Thank you. So what we're going to cover in the next 90 minutes is we'll do a couple of quick introductions and community agreements. We'll do an overview of COVID-19 impacts on LGBTQ plus communities. I will probably just defer to start saying queer and trans communities. Know that that is a lot of what our communities do. Then we'll talk a little bit about specific legal needs, and then we will have about 30 minutes at the end to share some knowledge, apply skills, and have a deeper group conversation. So I will introduce myself. My name is Denise Diskin. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm the executive director of the Q Law Foundation of Washington. I've been in this role since January of 2019. And prior to that, I spent about 10 years in private practice representing folks in employment discrimination cases, as well as representing families in family law disputes and doing some general LGBTQ civil rights legal work. So I really love working within my queer and trans communities. And so this is a privilege and honor to do this work. Al, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Alphonse Littlejohn, or Al Littlejohn. I use they and he pronouns primarily. I've been in this position since January of this year. I'm the Community Legal Resources Manager, and I've been in Seattle since about October of 2018, doing community organizing and living my best life. So happy to be here and share this great information with all of y'all today.
We are just really privileged to have Al working with Q Law Foundation and doing our community legal resources development and outreach. It's just been a beautiful time. Al, do you want to advance us to the next slide? And the next slide is yours.
All right, so we want to take some time for a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional land of the Coast Salish people, the traditional home of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoots nations. We acknowledge their past and present existence and honor them and the land itself with gratitude. We acknowledge the ways in which the legal system we operate in has historically and recently acted to strip Indigenous cultures of land rights, cultural practices, and family history. We commit to being agents of change. And Denise just dropped a link in the chat so folks can identify where they're located on Indigenous land. And also wanted to note realrentduwamish.org. So Real Rent calls on people who live and work in Seattle to make rent payments to the Duwamish tribe, who is yet to be justly compensated for their land, resources, and livelihood, or acknowledged by the federal, state, and local governments. All right, so some agreements for today. We ask folks to move up and move back. If you find you have a lot to say generally, please make space for other folks to share or ask questions. There's shared assumption that it's an unequal system, unequal systems exist, and this includes the legal system. We ask that folks treat each other with respect and dignity, acknowledge that everyone can harm and can be harmed. HALT, which stands for hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. This is about taking care of your needs. So if you need to use the restroom or step away, please do whatever you need to do for yourself in this space. And if there are any other suggestions, feel free to put them in the chat. But we ask that you have water so you can stay hydrated, and please have a snack because this is a lunch and learn. Thanks. All right, so starting with a little introduction or overall statistical demographic overall review of LGBTQ people in Washington. So about 5% of the LGBTQ community or of the overall population in Washington identifies as part of the LGBTQ community in comparison to about 4.5% of the US general population. We want to take into consideration that there are lots of folks who may still need services who are part of this community, but may not identify with that community. So there are still folks that you may interact with along the way who still need this sort of support and knowledge in order to receive competent resources. Also want to make notice that Washington State is one of the top ranked states for LGBTQ equality and sexual orientation and gender identity when it comes to non-discrimination laws. And part of myself coming here and doing this work, Seattle is seen as a trans safe haven for a lot of folks across the country because of the source of resources here. And so I want to make space to acknowledge that queer and trans folks come from all over the country just to be houseless in Seattle and in Washington in order to access some resources. When it comes to POC folks, generally the population is about 31% are non-LGBT identifying POC folks. Our community is about 29%. Our community, about 28% are raising children. And we know those who have children during the impacts of COVID have had a lot of specific issues that need even more support or further exacerbate other needs that folks have. Generally, we're a pretty young population in Washington. So 57% of LGBTQ folks in Washington are under the age of 35, compared to those under the age of 35 who are non-LGBT, which is 28%. When it comes to food security, this was considered not having enough money to buy food that you need or that your family needed in the past 12 months. And we found that 25% of our community identified as food insecure in comparison to 12% of the population. And then when it came to income, 22% of our community have an income that is less than $24,000 in comparison to 15%. And identifying or noticing that many folks in community work in the gig economy. A lot of times they work in entertainment because when you've had systemic discrimination and not had access to the workplace, there's always been space to provide entertainment to the white gays and the straight gays, and gays as in like eyes, not gays. So looking at some big outcomes or impacts that COVID has had on everyday life and community, in interacting with other organizations as an organization via Q Law or just as an individual, it's pretty well known that folks need financial assistance. Money runs a lot of things and it can help solve a lot of places. And because of COVID, folks' housing, employment, healthcare have all been thrown out the window. So this money is used for whether it's rental assistance or to help cover food along with food vouchers or to cover medical expenses. like your medicines themselves or saving for a procedure or even covering transportation. In our relationships, we saw that within the household, there's definitely increased instances of domestic violence or intimate partner violence because of the economic stressors that were even more pushed to the limits because of COVID. For employment, we saw folks become even less employed than they already had access to. 40% of LGBTQ folks nationally work in the top 5 industries that were impacted by COVID in comparison to 22% of the general population. And because of this, folks' housing was at risk. A lot of folks right now are having to essentially squat where they are because folks are anxiously waiting for the moratorium to come down. So there's a number of ways people are trying to find a way to meet this need, but right now it's not looking too great. We're quickly approaching the end of March. With healthcare, of course, because of the work that we do, we're at higher risk of contracting COVID due to workplace exposure or even comorbidities because of lack of access to the healthcare system. We saw increase in general isolation, and this is especially felt by our elders who may not have access to familiar support, or because of that and needing healthcare services at the home, they've been essentially forced to go back into the closet to have access to these resources. And generally, overall, not just LGBTQ folks, but everyone has been impacted when it comes to their mental health around social interactions and feeling like those needs haven't been met. And then transportation is another big one. I'm personally am someone who owns a car in my small immediate network of people. And that's a huge privilege. And you can do a lot of things with a car. And given because of the COVID pandemic, public transportation is not safe. And to not forget that for cutie BIPOC folks especially, public transportation can already not be safe. So a lot of times financial assistance also goes towards supporting people in buying their own car or utilizing like Lyft or Uber. All right, some big facts, because some people like to see the numbers. Overall economic impacts. So for existing poverty levels or poverty rates in Washington for LGBTQ folks overall, we saw 36%. So 36% of people who identify as LGBT were at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. And this is just the number for overall, so the average of the LGBTQ community, but for Black folks, that was 49%, and for those who were Indigenous, that was 55%. 75% of folks reported having their work affected, but not stopped completely or ended up stopped working completely. And for those who stopped working completely, that was 32%. And about only 30% who have stopped working at this point have found a job. Nationally, as mentioned a little bit earlier, 40% of our community work in the top 5 impacted industries, which includes restaurants and food services, hospitals, K through 12 and higher education, and retail industries in comparison with 22%. And with that, 20% of LGBTQ folks reported not requesting sick or caretaker leave due to fear of discrimination if it would require disclosing their LGBTQ identity, which further puts them at risk in the workplace. Some overall healthcare impacts. So nationally, 23% of LGBTQ adults of color, 22% of trans adults, and 32% of trans adults of color have no form of healthcare coverage. In Washington, we saw that about 76% of our community had delayed healthcare needs because about 60% said that, 76 have delayed needed care, including 63% who have just postponed that care even when they knew that they were sick. And over half of the population reported that they had a deep distrust in doctors or medical healthcare providers. Nationally, 8% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual adults and 29% of transgender adults reported healthcare refusal due to LGBTQ identity, which of course was only further exacerbated by COVID. And with that, folks were 7 times more likely to report avoiding a visit to the doctor's office to avoid discrimination. The most common reasons for delayed medical care were, as listed before, distrust in doctors, financial barriers to care, perception of lack of availability of LGBTQ-friendly services, and lack of transportation. And it's also important to keep in mind that nearly 1/3 of the community experienced suicidal ideation in the past year. And that was even more heightened for trans and gender diverse adults at about 40%. This is really important, I think, especially for folks who are located in Eastern Washington, because it showed that their physical and mental health outcomes, as well as substance use, were also increased in folks who were in the eastern part of the states. About a quarter of participants are also regularly providing assistance to a friend or family member who has a health problem or a disability. Because of having lack of access, we've often had to rely on each other to get the support that we need. All right, so going into a little bit about the work that we were doing at Q-Law, as well as how knowledge is shared within community. And all of this I'm about to go over is important because in order to serve our community, you have to know what we do and how we move. So it was very important right from the start to meet with those directly impacted early on in the work, to make special note that often work that is made to support marginalized communities somehow generally end up not involving us until the very last step. Like, oh, sign this legislation, or oh, please agree with this statement that we did not involve you in at all or ask you about. So it was very important to just be able to go into those spaces and listen to their needs because folks know what they need. And it was especially important as a legal organization to recognize the privilege we held in that space. And even though it was like, oh, 2 organizations getting together, there's big weight felt when it comes to interacting with the legal system in regards to community focused organizations and interacting. And it was beneficial to me to be in the space as someone who actively works in community, because there was a lot of information that we were able to access that Q-Law would not have been able to access otherwise. And it was also important, of course, to keep in mind that strangers are just people you haven't met yet, especially in the QT BIPOC community with how small it is. Chances are, if you're looking for someone or looking for some sort of information, someone around you knows it or already has that information. Moving into written communication, really a lot of that being focusing on people's reliance on the internet and sharing via social media. That's how folks are able to share resources as quickly as possible in a lot of cases. And we have to keep in mind that even with that, there's still a lot of community members who don't have access to the internet or stable internet connection in order to get in connection with resources or find out about the most recent thing that has happened. So it's important to keep in mind having to also offer that aid in just being able to connect to the resources in the first place. It was also brought up time and time again that there's plenty of resources in a lot of cases written in English, but not in other languages. And this came up especially in doing work for non-English speaking community. A lot of the resources are focused on Spanish speaking communities, but we know that there are a lot more languages than that. And there are folks in all sorts of communities around our state that need that language assistance. And it's important that folks are able to communicate in their language, because that's how they're able to give consent to what is going on and really be informed about the decisions that they're making, especially when it comes to the legal system. And then community networks, of course, that's who we're interacting with in a lot of cases on social media, in those groups, our friends, our families, word of mouth, or associated groups like community-focused nonprofits. Ones to list are Lavender Rights Project, being another legal queer organization, the Alphabet Alliance of Color, which is another nonprofit that is made primarily by cutie BIPOC folks who want to identify restorative ways of moving through predominantly white nonprofits. Chief Seattle, which is support for Indigenous community, especially when it comes to housing resources. Entre Hermanos being another legal associate of ours who supports Spanish speakers, or the Northwest Network of Queer Survivors. Again, organizations that were made by people who were most impacted for the people who need it the most, which is their own communities. And all of this comes, of course, from mutual aid, because as mentioned before, community has been doing a lot of these things even prior to COVID happening, because we've had to depend on ourselves in order to access these resources or meet our needs in a number of ways. All right, so some community solutions, how communities handling these changes, as well as how we always work to handle the fact that a lot of our needs are not met. Double down, mutual aid. It's really just about doing things for the folks that we care about, and the folks that we care about also include the folks that we may not even know yet and may never end up knowing. It's just about identifying or recognizing that everyone has needs that should be met and deserve to be met, and that everyone has something to offer to help meet those needs. And it's important, I think, in doing this work of thinking about working from a place of abundance and not a place of scarcity, because you'll be surprised what asking a question into a random group of people will bring to you. A lot of times it could be very close to you and you may not even know if you don't ask. And to name some mutual aid efforts that popped up with COVID, it's COVID-19 mutual aid, which is just a community of people who are wanting to meet the needs of other community members, their neighbors, their loved ones. Tawaxin, they're a trans women of color solidarity network. They've been around since 2018, and those are made by a group of trans identified queer people of color themselves who recognize lots of nonprofits hold on to money, and that really there should be unrestricted access to funds for community. So everything that they do is about crowdfunding and just taking in direct donations from people and then directly routing them to people to get a hotel if they're out on the street that night, or get a new jacket, or whatever it might be, cover their meds, cover a Lyft ride, groceries, whatever it may be. Queer the Land, QTL, another group of cutie BIPOC folk who recognize that we really don't have space, as like we are often not homeowners, and it's hard to build equity or have stable housing, and stable housing is integral in being able to access other parts of your life or get support and have those be easier in navigating in comparison to having to meet all your needs while also couch surfing or being out on the streets. With that, just general community education, a lot of nonprofits who also do direct services do things like know your rights, because they know community does not have access directly to legal aid service providers. And so they're essentially the conduit in between that of letting folks know this is the basics so that you can get yourself by for some amount of time, generally until you're fired, you're kicked out, whatever it might be, because of the outcomes normally stacked against us. But it's important that we're the ones who deliver the messages to our own community to make sure that it's actually retained and seen as useful. Other community solutions, my favorite one is transformative justice and healing. And this is really about, I would say, decentering the legal system and really focusing on the fact is all humans in general could do for some transformative justice and healing. And it's really about being able to make space for the person who has been harmed, and then have them be able to name the accountability process that best fits them, that will actually bring about change. Because even if someone steals to have a need met and then ends up returning the thing that they stole, at the end of the day, those needs aren't met. And transformative justice is about really making sure everyone's needs are met and that harm is addressed, and that we do that collectively in a way that doesn't center cancel culture. And then at the bottom of the list are generally legal options. So I would say I'm a firm believer that folks don't need laws in order to be good people. And in a lot of cases, especially as a Black individual, a lot of laws were not made to help us. And in a lot of cases, even laws that are made to help us or are put on the books, like hate crime laws, it is very hard in order to still be able to access justice or even get things to be acknowledged for what they actually are. So what now? Where do we go from here, and what is community looking for? So a really big part of this is direct relationships with legal aid providers wherever they are. We're a big believer that folks deserve to get resources where they're located and not have to be in another part of the state reaching out to Seattle just because Seattle and King County is what is seen as all of the resources. So it's really about making space for lawyers and community members to get together. And I think especially right now, it's that much easier because there aren't physical barriers like there used to be. And it builds space and trust for legal aid providers to come in and to be able to help educate folks if they have questions on needs being met. One of the things that come to mind is Utopia, Washington. They have a support group called Transaction, which is for cutie BIPOC folks, specifically trans folks who have to or interact with the sex economy, our sex workers. They said that it would be very beneficial to just have someone come in and say, these are your rights. These are the things that you need to be concerned about so that folks can make solutions for themselves that are most appropriate to themselves. And I want to definitely encourage folks to look in their local or their personal communities. If you've ever gone to a Pride before, you have connections in some way, somehow. I would encourage you to not just forget about the card you got or that little handout. Even a cold contact to that one person could do a lot. Or before COVID, you remember going to a bar that did drag performances? Great. Well, then you know a place where queer community is together and can trust being able to access certain things in that space. General, as said before, having resources that just list like know your rights and general legal information is very beneficial to community, because this allows them to be able to come up with, again, solutions or brainstorm about other options of things that they may want to do in regards to accessing or not accessing the legal system. For immigration in our conversations with WISN, which is a Washington, oh, let me not blank now. Washington Alliance for Immigrants Solidarity Network. I'm probably butchering that. Okay, Denise gave me the thumbs up, great. Well, they're a statewide organization of immigrants themselves and folks who want to do support for the community, who said that even with the changeover in administration, folks were immediately seeing changes in how they were interacting with the deportation machine, and how it was really important to be able to come up with those strategies and have space for those ideas in community, to then bring them to legal aid providers, because folks' lived reality on the ground is realistically what they're concerned about. So even if the books say it's supposed to look like this, we know it often doesn't. And with that, of course, making sure resources are accessible to folks in more languages than just Spanish. Of course, to add to the toolbox of things is continuing to come up with solutions that don't involve the legal system or have minimal involvement with the legal system. So again, just general things, know your rights, knowing what they can do or can't do, what they don't have to follow through with, or have options to go forward with or go another route, etc. Ultimately, being able to offer people options is what self-determination is about, because the person will know what feels best for them. And for just de-escalating interpersonal resolution tips. So if there's a way to not interact with the legal system, how can you offer that support and making sure they don't have to get wrapped up in it in the first place? And of course, Denise will talk a little bit more about it, but having things like outlines of legal expectations of interacting with whatever the system may be, or about what is acceptable in the courtroom or how to build evidence. Those are the sorts of things that are helpful to community before they even come to legal aid providers.
Great, thank you, Al. So while Al is transitioning control of the slides over to me, I will just talk a little bit about ethics in the RPCs as they pertain to LGBTQ communities and representing LGBTQ communities. And you know, you will get a copy of all these slides, so you'll notice that I kind of skate over the top of some of them because otherwise we would be here all day. But I wanted to just, you know, make our ethics credits worthwhile and clarify some important areas where the RPCs cover how we can approach representation of LGBTQ and particularly QT BIPOC folks in the legal system. So RPC 8.4 is pretty obvious. Don't discriminate. That's an ethical violation. And if you don't feel like you can do the work, withdraw and let someone else do it. And that's okay. Actually, our communities would prefer it if you do that. RPC 1.1 about competency is really just know how legal issues impact your clients in their full identities. And if you're not sure, ask for help. Q Law Foundation is a great resource. One of the things that I offer is litigation support. So if you're looking at litigation that engages LGBTQ issues, or you're not sure, you should feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to sit down and hash out your case analysis and help you strategize. And then really, you know, a lot of the approach that we take at Q Law Foundation is about informed consent, right? That's part of competency, is making sure that you understand what the implications of your legal approach will be for your client, both in terms of how they will be presented in legal pleadings, but also in terms of how they will be asked to interact with the court system, I come from a plaintiff side, so I always say defense attorneys, but with opposing counsel and other other folks in the process, and having meaningful conversations with your client about those implications, so that you can be sure that that you're in alignment and that there's no unintended consequences of some of the legal decisions that you make. Confidentiality, RPC 1.6, is really deep for our community. I always lovingly say that our community is like, they talk about there's lots of fish in the sea. Well, our community is more like a kiddie pool. We all know each other. The likelihood, and that crosses attorney and community lines. So the likelihood that we are, that we are interconnected is really high. And remember that when your client, particularly a QT BIPOC person, when they walk through the door, they've placed a huge amount of trust in you. All of those statistics that Al reviewed and some of the ones that I will review are all hurdles that people have gotten over, in addition to the regular intake hurdles, in addition to the scariness that comes with having a legal issue. And so really guard that trust and guard that privacy. And I view the trust that our communities put in Q Law Foundation as sacred. And so we have very clear protocols and rules about confidentiality that go beyond don't share identifying details, because identifying details are kind of meaningless in our community, right? Like you could say, hey, I know this attorney who has brown hair and does a lot of LGBTQ stuff. And within about 3 guesses, a lot of folks in our community would probably get to me, not because I'm fancy, because I'm not, but because our communities are small and really interconnected. And then I also wanted to call our attention to the preamble of the RPCs about being a conscientious and ardent advocate. And we'll come back to this a couple of times, but really just centering that part of our obligation as legal services providers is to listen carefully and be alert to our own biases and others' biases, and to really make it part of our practice to recognize those biases and make a plan for how to intervene. And so really grounding that not just in we want to be good people, but also grounding that in our professional obligations, because if we're not doing that, then we can't do any of the other stuff appropriately and ethically and fully for our clients. All right, now I'm going to see if I can advance. There we go. Okay. So I'm not going to touch on every single one of these statistics, but just know that LGBTQ people, and particularly queer and trans BIPOC folks, are overrepresented in low-income populations, as Al covered. And within that context, we experience civil legal needs at a much higher rate than the general low-income population. And then when you take race or disability or other marginalized experiences into account, you just got to crank that dial up even higher. That's the takeaway from this slide, really. And I do want to make a note about demographics and statistics. You'll notice that we're really weaving together national and state statistics. And you'll notice that these stats are from the 2016 supplemental Washington Civil Legal Needs Survey. It's because when the Civil Legal Needs Survey was done in 2015, it did not include sexual orientation or gender identity as a factor. And this is a really good example of what Al was talking about our communities being engaged after the fact. Because when I look at the Civil Legal Needs Survey, and I pull from that supplemental data, often I'm looking at the legal issues and I'm thinking, gosh, I actually would have really framed this legal need really differently if I had been allowed to ask the questions. But because we were asking the same questions that were asked of general low-income populations, not only were we not in the first bucket, and so we don't have the same kind of demographic data spread that the general low-income population has, we also are not always getting questions asked that are relevant to our experience or asked in a way that allows a full representation of our experience. And that's no shade to the folks who put together the Civil Legal Needs Survey, right? That's, I'm just pointing out that, like, even this year, COVID-19 data in Washington does not include COVID-19 impact on LGBTQ communities. So various organizations and entities have had to extrapolate. Just know that there's a real limitation there and that we need to be more purposeful about weaving LGBTQ folks into these demographic studies. I can see I'm going to continue to fight with the slides. Come on. I'm going to kind of cover a few different legal issues. So I'll start with employment. The biggest takeaway in terms of what we see at our LGBTQ legal clinic and what we hear from community about employment is that discrimination is a factor. So much discrimination. I cannot tell you a case that I have reviewed or supervised in our LGBTQ legal clinic that was about unemployment issues, that was about workplace safety or PPE, that was about layoffs, that was about any sort of, wage theft, any of the common workplace issues that did not have an element of discrimination to it. So you always want to be asking, how is discrimination impacting folks' experience of general workplace issues? And even more so, asking your client about comparator questions. So most of you are not working in an area where you're doing employment discrimination cases, and that's fair. But often you can be looking for things like co-counsel, or you can be looking for other elements to weave in that are facts that make your case stronger when you are asking those questions. So if you're working with folks who are saying, our boss at the restaurant we work at is not giving us PPE, we're expected to reuse masks, we're not given masks, our masks are faulty, whatever the issue is, ask questions like, is that happening across the board for every employee? Are there certain employees who have better access than other employees? How are different groups of people treated in your workplace? And those can all be really good questions to ask that can help you get at whether, at the degree to which discrimination is an issue. Also asking questions like, is there a reason that you feel like you can't raise these issues with your supervisor, or that your boss is not receptive? Often it will be things like, well, they will listen to the white employees, but they won't listen to the employees of color. And so that's an additional issue. I'm not sure why we leapt to identity documents. Okay. So to talk briefly about identity documents, these are important because anytime you have to show your ID or verify your identification, this is going to be an issue. This is going to be a tension, and not just an actual issue or tension, but a site where cutie BIPOC folks are going to be worrying. And this has everything to do with access to basic services. And just access to basic respect. I have dealt with a lot of cases of employment discrimination that is related to gender and documentation mismatches. And most importantly, it often leads to incorrect court records in both civil and criminal court, where a person's legal name may be their dead name, meaning the name that they no longer use after a gender transition. And use of that name can be really harmful to the individual. It is really difficult to change these documents on a good day, right? Without a pandemic, it is difficult to change these documents, and very expensive, about $200 for just the legal name change process. And we're looking at about 5 identity documents that folks have to change in order to get a globally consistent identity documents. Access to courts has been remedied, but is not, but some of the appointments are pretty limited. And then once you get your legal name change, you have to go to a bunch of different offices to make sure that all of your actual used documents are updated. And Department of Licensing, like where you have your driver's license or your ID, and the Social Security Administration there can be some conflict there if you don't do your Social Security change and your DOL change at the same time, and that can cause people's licenses to be suspended if they don't know that, or if they have access to one office but not access to the other. So I guess the takeaway from this is inconsistency is happening all over the place, and it's turning an already administratively burdensome process into a little bit of a nightmare. I would say, I spend a lot of time on social media related to our communities to track things like legal issues. And I would say that this is coming up 1 to 2 times a week, just in like the Seattle Queer Exchange, it's just a really common tension that folks are struggling to navigate. So touching on domestic violence and intimate partner violence. I think a couple of the takeaways from this are, and I'll answer I want to answer actually the question in the chat about, has COVID-19 made identity documents worse and harder? Yes, because all the offices are closed. So where you would normally be able to walk in, which is, you know, its own experience in terms of how you might be treated when you walk in, but you can get things done in a day that would otherwise take weeks. Most of those have switched to mail, or people are making appointments like, you know, an hour away and having to make those appointments a month out in order to go in person. So yes, it's really slowed things down. To talk about domestic violence and intimate partner violence, the one important thing here is don't overlook housemates. And I think because I was having technical difficulties with the slides, I actually skipped the housing slide. So I'm gonna have to figure out how to go back to that in a minute. But I will say that our communities are much more likely to be in rental situations and in group housing situations. And so you really, and remember that the domestic violence statute includes housemates, that interpretation. And, you know, a lot of times what we're hearing from community partners is that we really need a cost-benefit analysis of engaging with law enforcement and engaging with the courts. So folks really need to understand what's going to happen when I make this decision. What's the cost-benefit analysis? And really needing to understand that, you know, even in very severe situations of domestic or intimate partner violence, folks in our communities know that jail is a place that is not just a place you put someone to get them out of your house, right? That is a place where they, particularly if you have a trans or non-binary identifying partner that is that is abusing you, a lot of folks are like, it's just a different decision when you're thinking about, do I want to send this person to a place where they are going to be dead named, where they are going to be outed, where they're going to be assaulted, and where they're going to be exposed to COVID? Do I want to do all of those things? And that really changes the decision-making for folks. It also changes the decision-making that it is a hugely common experience in our communities to have bad experiences with law enforcement officers because of racism, because of homophobia, and because of transphobia. Law enforcement officers tends to be assault, a lack of believing our communities. So, and we all know that, that particularly Black people are far more likely to be killed by law enforcement officers than any other group. So with all of those facts, thinking about the decision-making of a queer or trans survivor of violence and really helping think about what's the consequence for that person when they contact law enforcement, and factoring that into safety planning is really, really key. Also, some unintended consequences like no contact orders that folks maybe don't anticipate will come from a call to the police. So maybe the decision is, I want to call the police today because I want to be safe today, and not knowing, oh, that means that I don't have control over whether they enter a no contact order or not. That can be a really serious issue. And then similarly with accessing the courts, survivors of violence really need A, to be able to have trust and access to legal aid providers, and B, to have a need to understand the outcomes, right? So not just, and I'm finding this a lot as someone who is shepherding people through the legal system, it's not just how do we, you know, like, it's not just, sure, go ahead and call the courts, and, you know, here's the webpage on how to fill out your protection order documentation, but it's, let's talk through how likely you are to receive this order. Let's talk through what your experience is going to be like in the courtroom. Let's talk through what resources you want to have available. Do you want to have a friend with you? Or you know, do you want to have someone there with you at just the hearing or at all of the filing processes? Do you have access to that person? You know, is it going to be by Zoom? Is it going to be by phone, right? All of these different questions, folks really need the ability to know that ahead of time, because the barrier in terms of accessing the courts is so much larger for LGBTQ folks. So I'm going to touch on houselessness briefly, and then I'm going to do housing, and I'm going to try to be quick because I'm aware of the time. Okay. So COVID-19 impacts and houselessness. The big takeaway from this set of information is that you're going to be seeing a lot of, with queer and trans communities, you're going to be seeing a lot of couch surfing, vehicle living, and other sort of mutual aid temporary supports. King County, I don't know if this is a widely known statistic, but there is a study that found that King County and Los Angeles County have the 2 highest rates, both in terms of numbers and percentages of unsheltered non-binary people in the country. And so that just means that folks are, you know, you're unlikely to find our communities in shelters. And when we are in shelters, it is a last ditch, desperate measure. And it is likely to come with a lot of conflict. And one of the biggest things that we have learned from our community partner engagement is that shelter grievance procedures, there's sort of no remedy for difficulties that queer and trans people experience in shelters. Because the internal grievance procedures, things like, you know, somebody stole my sleeping bag kind of conflict resolution internal procedures, either do not consider discrimination to be their jurisdiction, or you're asking the agency itself to adjudicate its discriminatory practices, right? So that doesn't really work super well. And the other problem is that the other remedies we have, like the Seattle Office for Civil Rights that might navigate public accommodations complaints or similar agencies, are not geared towards the kinds of quick resolutions that unhoused people need. And you're asking someone to engage in and they do investigation, not advocacy. So there's, you know, it's a difficult and very long-term process and requires a lot of touches with the agency, with the investigating agency in order to deal with the situation. And that's multiple touches is just not something that unhoused and unsheltered people can navigate. To respond to the question in the chat about trans women and specifically Black trans women accessing shelters, yes, sex segregated shelters are a huge, huge issue because there's a lot of transphobia and lack of understanding of trans women's experiences in both in terms of people who use shelters, who are often survivors of trauma and assault, and also on the part of shelter staff who may not have great training on, you know, on these issues and who may not come from trans communities themselves or come from trans knowledgeable communities. So those are some tensions. And I think the big takeaway that we can take from this today is that what it does is it pushes people outside, which means that folks are more isolated. They're more at risk from assault by members of the public and by law enforcement. And they're more likely to be engaging with law enforcement generally. And that can create just a whole host of issues. Again, then we're talking about jail where there is dead naming, outing, assault, and COVID, right? So, so these are all really complicated issues, but this is an area where, you know, there is some potential for positive movement, for example, with the Ombuds office that is hopefully going to be established with the new King County regional approach to homelessness, but that's a ways away for folks that are unhoused now. I do want to talk about housing, and I'm going to see if I can quickly back up to the beginning.
Denise, may I make an extra note?
Yes, please do. And then I'm actually just going to ask you to back me up to the housing slide. I'm so sorry, Al.
No, that's fine. I also want to bring up, because there's not only those experiences, but what I've seen in supporting and just being a part of community is that trans men and trans masculine folks also have their own issues with navigating sex segregated shelters, especially when in a lot of cases, like, women's shelters might be connected with like actually having resources for kids. And in a lot of cases, trans masculine folks or men who may be utilizing those spaces may also have kids that are with them as well. That adds a layer to it.
Great. Thanks, Al.
Backing up. Right there.
Perfect, thank you. So just to touch on some of the housing implications, and I saw in the chat earlier that someone let us know that King County has extended the eviction moratorium to June 30th, and we're looking at the likelihood that Governor Inslee will do that as well. I cannot express to you, I did not know that actually until I saw that in the chat, so thank you. And I can't express to you the relief that that brings me, because every single community partner we have talked to, sorry, City of Seattle, not all of King County, thank you for the correction. Every single community partner we have talked to has said, we are terrified of this moratorium being lifted. It is going to push so many people into homelessness, and we're trying to gear up with everything that we have, but we really need this. Like we need more time, we need more resources. This is just, it's a really, really big deal. So this is, I'm really glad to hear that. And, you know, for anybody who may be here that has Governor Inslee's ear, please know that we really, really need this. It's a really, really big deal. And I'm really worried about the amount of houselessness that will come from the lifting of the moratorium. And for the reasons being, we are very likely to be in rental housing, living with roommates rather than nuclear family. And we're really, really likely, we almost always in the LGBTQ legal clinic are seeing folks living in non-standard situations. You know, all kinds of, you know, and again, this comes from our community connections too. It's like, well, I don't want my friend to be houseless, so I'm going to convert my, you know, my closet space or my dining room, or, you know, we'll put somebody in the garage, right? Like, and a lot of it is happening off lease or with, you know, text agreements, and those situations can sometimes go south really quickly. And so I think the takeaways for this are to look, you know, be on the lookout for shadow evictions, meaning evictions that are about driving a person out, not filing an unlawful detainer, right? I have not typically, I can't think of a single unlawful detainer case that has come through our LGBTQ legal clinic. And it may just be that the Housing Justice Project is doing a kick-ass job all over the state. And it is also that what we are most likely to hear is, my lease isn't up, I can't stay in this situation anymore. I just can't. And I don't know where I'm gonna find a new place. I don't wanna have to leave. My landlord's not listening, or my landlord is trying to push me out. And so we're seeing a lot of that. And so I think the takeaway here is really to be ready to work with your client on both legal and non-legal solutions. Find out what their resources are, what their goals are, and be ready to not have clean paperwork. And you know, and for all of these, another big takeaway is to really familiarize yourself with mutual aid networks, because you can't assume that your client is going to be in the queer and trans hive mind, right? Often folks are really, that isolation is real if folks don't have steady access to the internet or are not on social media, or it's just, you know, we're preoccupied with survival. They're not thinking outside the box that way. And so you can really do a huge service to clients by saying, you know, let me think about some resources for financial assistance. And then having a working knowledge of where those resources are, what organizations are passing funds out to folks and through to folks. And I will just tell you a lot of how I learn this information. It's not like magic. I am also not in the hive mind. I follow the organizations on social media. And so if you are a person who is really interested in serving LGBTQ communities, and particularly queer and trans BIPOC communities, I encourage you to join all of the queer Facebook groups in your local area, and the trans Facebook groups in your local area. Follow organizations on Instagram. We're really super active on Instagram, and they are putting out the requests and they are putting out the resources. And it's a great way to sort of passively knowledge gather, and then you have those tools at the ready. And I can't tell you enough, like, how much, when I say anecdata from a wide variety of sources in our sourcing here, I'm talking about, like, I'm in the Seattle Queer Exchange, the Washington State Trans Network, right? All of these different groups. And I would estimate I'm answering between 1 and 3 legal questions a week. And you can do that without, like, putting your bar number at risk, right? Typically I'm saying, this sounds like a really tough situation. You can contact the LGBTQ legal clinic at Q Law Foundation. Here's the link to sign up online for an appointment. You know, I usually put a disclaimer or, you know, full disclosure, I work for Q Law Foundation, just so people know that I am a real person and I am connected to this work. And I do actually recognize some names of folks in this group today that also do that. So thank you for your efforts. Al, do you mind fast forwarding me to the legal system stuff? I've gone a little bit over time, so I wanna motor ahead. And I think it's, yes, this one, thank you, you're the best. So let's talk for a minute about what queer and trans people experience in the legal system. The big takeaway here is that attorneys were the biggest, the group that was most likely to hear discriminatory comments in courts. That makes a lot of sense, right? We're in courts all the time for all kinds of different reasons. But this is why you need to be prepared. And I'll talk about how to be prepared in a minute. But I want to tell you, give you a picture based on a recent experience with a community member that I was helping to navigate an anti-harassment order that had been filed against them. The circumstances of the order are not important. I will just say I didn't think it legally merited an anti-harassment order, and one was not entered at the end, but her experience in accessing the courtroom as a Black trans woman is that the opposing party repeatedly misgendered her in both the filed pleadings and in the court conversation. She had designated her pronouns in her responsive document. So she had said, I am person X, she, her, in her documents. And yet the opposing party continued to misgender her in the courtroom. And she was in a little bit of a pickle, right? Like, there's a white judge who she knows nothing about. She doesn't know if she can speak up. She's not represented, so she doesn't know if she can speak up. She doesn't know how to speak up. She's a very skilled self-advocate, so she made one correction. The judge got very bristly, and it seemed clear that there was, on the judge's part, an inclination to view her as more aggressive because she is Black and the other party is white.
Wow.
So that was, it was a really intense situation for her. And the judge did nothing to intervene about her gender pronouns. So in that situation, she was left to navigate the remainder of the 20 or 30 minutes of this hearing. There was like new evidence, so it was kind of long, while being misgendered and worried about saying anything to step out of line or that might be perceived as stepping out of line by this judge, because she was worried that she would then end up with an order entered against her, and not knowing anything about the process of how you might appeal that or reconsider it or all of those, all of that procedural stuff. And that was, it was just such an intense example for me of what this experience looks like for our communities as we enter the courts. So, engaging in QT BIPOC positive advocacy. A couple of notes, and I want to answer actually a good question in the chat about how frequently we see these issues in Washington courts. I can't really give you a great answer to that because there isn't really a lot of studies being done, and often our communities are not inclined to, like, there isn't really a repository for that. So Q Law Foundation sort of generally, is out in the world, but we do not have the resources, for example, to go to courts and advocate on behalf of people and navigate and represent in those situations. There isn't really an organization who does, which is why I'm presenting on this, because all of you are in courts all over the state of Washington every single day doing amazing work. So a few tips about advocacy, and this is sort of like client, attorney to community, attorney to client tips. It's important to believe our experiences and not to assume our trust, right? Again, really recognize what it takes for someone to get to you, and recognize that they're coming in with a fair amount of well-earned skepticism, and it's not about you, it's about the system. Don't assume the name and pronoun in your file are correct. You always want to ask. And that's just because I know a lot of you are working with Legal Server, and that sometimes the way that Legal Server passes information through, it doesn't capture some of these things. Your database and where you work may not capture any of it. So just make sure that you get really practiced at asking. Doing affirmative outreach to local LGBTQ community groups or community leaders just to find out what's happening, right? Tell me what your needs are. A lot of times that's how Al and I start out our meetings with community groups, is just tell us what's going on, what's on your mind right now. And then really thinking about integrating transphobia and homophobia into your anti-racism work. Now, I don't want to take away from racism by saying this, right? And so I recognize the weight of a white queer cisgender person saying this. But what I do want to say is that one of the aspects of racism is that it negates the wide variety of cultural, ethnic, racial, indigenous experiences of gender and sexual orientation, right? I'm not going to say a lot about white supremacy culture because that's a big concept. Go read about it. But white supremacy culture as a function is both racism and transphobia and homophobia. And so my experience as a white person is not the same as the experience of a cutie BIPOC person, but it is sort of different branches coming from the same root. And check your systems. When are you asking for demographic information? Are you asking gender and sexual orientation in the first 5 questions that you ask a person before you talk about their legal issue? Because when you do that, you're asking a person who their relationships are, and like you're asking people essentially like, who do you have sex with and what's in your pants before you've said anything else to them. That's kind of a lot, right? So think about, what do you need to know to have a good conversation, right? You probably need to know the name. Ask what name a person wants to be called, because when they're engaging with lawyers, our communities think that they have to give their legal name. It happens to me all the time, all the time. And then ask, what pronouns do you want me to use? Mine or she, her? So really checking your systems and making sure that every single person who has client contact, every single person in your organization, because there are queer and trans people of color who work for your organization, make sure that everybody knows how to gather necessary information with care and respect. And here I want to make a little plug, because Q Law Foundation does do consulting and supportive work on this. So if you need some deep work in your systems and some recommendations about how to change your systems, or if you need some deep work about your practices or some training, please contact us. This is part of what we do, and we're happy to support your organization in really leveling up on this.
Didn't we say 1:30?
Okay, so I'm going to skip the next 2 slides because these are slides that basically, when you're representing a person, just pull this language. If you're like, I don't know how to talk about them in the pleadings, pull this language, cut and paste, plagiarize all day. That's what it's there for. Oops. Nope, I did that right. Okay. So now we're going to talk about supportive court interventions. So the first thing I want to say is talk to your client. Are they going to curl up in fear or trauma if you go in hard on a judge or opposing counsel who is misgendering them? Ask them what they want. Ask them what they want you to do and why that's their decision, so that you can really use an informed consent approach. Our folks tend to not like surprises about our identities, right? So the more pre-conversation you can have with a person, the better. Immediately respond to jokes, disrespect, misgendering on the record. And there's some helpful language here about how you make that objection. And you can make those objections in a lot of ways, but I really want to empower all of you to make those objections out loud and create a record. And about this, I want to say a couple of really important points. One is to practice using those objections, incorporate it into your hearing prep. And if you're concerned about the outcome it might have on your case, I want to point you to a Washington State Supreme Court case that just had oral argument yesterday. It's a little slept on, in my opinion, but it is Thompson v. Henderson. And it is a case that is a personal injury case with a Black woman plaintiff represented by a Black woman attorney. And the case is really about the level of discrimination and bias that was present in the woman's trial at the trial level, and how she did not get a fair hearing of her personal injury case because of the deep racism in the courtroom. And I want you to go back and watch that oral argument, because I will tell you, our state Supreme Court justices were not having it. And I think this is a really, really important case. And so if you're worried about how your record is going to come out, if you're worried about, is this going to, am I going to be able to navigate this on appeal? Well, a wonderful attorney named Vonda Sargent just paved that path for you and had oral argument yesterday. So I really encourage you to go seek that case out. Let's see. And then I want to talk just for a moment about sort of the power dynamics. So for attorneys who are in attendance right now, remember that you have a bar number and you can use it to make these objections. To white attorneys that are in attendance, you have the power of your whiteness. So that means that part of your practice, part of your daily work as a person and as an attorney is about learning how to recognize biases when they are showing up in front of you and to really practice being a good bystander. And I want you to be ready to do that for your colleagues, for other attorneys, in addition to your clients, right? Because we are hearing about wide experiences of both attorneys, clients, court staff, all kinds of folks who are experiencing discrimination in our courtroom, experiencing racism, experiencing transphobia, and experiencing homophobia in our courtroom. And as white attorneys, we have the power to be good bystanders, and we have the responsibility. So if you're seeing this, if it's your client, make your objections on the record. But if you're seeing a colleague, maybe even another attorney that you don't know, reach out to that person and say, hey, are you okay? How can I support you? Right? That goes such a long way for us creating a legal culture that is about support. Let's see. And then I think the last note I want to make, and yes, I will drop the case site for the Henderson case into the chat. Get to know your rules of evidence, right? This is a helpful way to make objections around gender and sexual orientation bias or racial bias in, to address some of the more nuanced ways that it may show up. And I want to call attention to especially ER 412 about sexual behavior and disposition. And I also want to call attention to ER 610. And I want to give you some confidence in using ER 610, which is about the interaction between a person's religious beliefs and their credibility as a witness. Now, I don't mean to disparage folks who have religious beliefs generally, or even who have homophobic or transphobic religious beliefs. My point is just to say that if you need to establish on the record that a person carries bias or discrimination in part because of their religiosity, you do have the ability, you don't want to just ask about that, but you do have the ability to ask questions about the nature of a person's religious beliefs if those beliefs are relevant to discrimination possibly that your client experienced. And I will just tell you, if you're like, Denise, I don't know what you're talking about, that sounds wild. I will tell you, Judge Kuhnauer gave me that objection in a deposition about 5 years ago. And so I have officially, you heard it here first, you can use this evidence rule successfully. So that is my presentation on legal issues. As is typical for me, I have gone over time, but we do have time for some questions and conversation, if I can ever advance this slide. So we have some discussion questions. These are just starters, really. So you can, call out in the chat or unmute yourself and go ahead and ask, ask one of these questions that feels good to you. But I also really want to encourage you to ask Al and I questions that might be on your mind, and let's sort of make this a knowledge sharing space about some of the stuff that is coming up for you all. Don't be shy. Good question in the chat. Let's see. Following social media. Let's see. We can definitely put that in, and also we can give you all a comprehensive list in a follow-up email. So yes, that is coming. Unpacking the use of mix. Al, do you want to take this one first?
Not specifically.
No? Okay. All right. Well, okay. Mix is an honorific for it's sort of an honorific like Mr. or Ms., but that is gender neutral. It is pronounced mix. And I have in the slide that I skipped because it's mostly just technical language, the way that you use it is the same way you would use Mr. or Ms. It's just mix, so-and-so, so-and-so. Often what I will do if I want to make sure that the court uses appropriate name and pronouns and doesn't, but it's not relevant and I don't really want to get into it, is I'll just put the person's name and then in parentheses put their pronouns. So I'll put in the chat what it might look like. So it would be like mix Joe Schmo. Good question about the analysis of the evidence rules. So that's a whole deep litigation conversation. So I think I don't have like a quick and dirty analysis, although I would like to find one. But we'll see what I'll see what I can come up with, because I think that is a good question. The other thing I'll say is, you know, the thing I love about the evidence rules is that they're kind of placeholders, right? They're ways that you keep your record clean. They're ways that you maintain kind of the direction that you want things to be going in court. And so I would say, you know, I really love the 401, 402, 403, that sort of group of evidence rules, because they're pretty flexible. Let's see. A good question about anti-harassment policies and equal employment opportunity policies, but nothing specifically addressing LGBTQ plus employees. I think that's really a thank you to that person for sharing, because I think it's worth taking a look at your employer's policies. Do you have a policy that includes, your policy probably includes sexual orientation and gender identity, just because that's Washington law and now federal law, but it probably doesn't address specific employee needs. One place to look is, does your family medical leave policy include chosen family, housemates, you know, non-typical nuclear family options? Just registered domestic partners or spouses is typically not sufficient to capture our full experiences in the way that we caretake. Additionally, you want to look and see if your employer has a transitioning at work policy, right? Because if you don't have that policy, then any trans person who applies to work at your organization is going to have to out themselves to ask. It is also really helpful to have a policy that says, in this workplace, we use people's appropriate names and pronouns. That is a fundamental expectation of working here. That is also a really, really helpful policy. So I really encourage folks to take a look at your internal policies and develop good ones. And again, that's an area where I will say, you know, I have a fair amount of experience. Gender neutral honorifics for attorneys. I don't know. I like counselor. I also really like Esquire, but that's just because I'm fancy. And I think the other thing to do is to ask folks how they would like to be referred to. I think counselor is a great generally respectful term for other attorneys. And so I think that that's one way to start. And then to, you know, one conversation I have had with counsel when I was in litigation was to say, you know, I always feel so stiff referring to you as counselor. You know, do you have a preference? Should I use an honorific and last name, or are we on a first name basis? And I try to be charming about it, and that often helps break the ice a little bit. I put on my Dolly Parton voice. Let's see, I'm just looking in the chat. Yeah, attorney last name is also a good idea. Good, so keep questions coming in the chat. If we missed one, feel free to pipe up. And I guess one thing I would like to ask is whether you feel like you can object to racism, transphobia, or homophobia in the courtroom, and what your barriers might be. I'd like to pose that specific question. And I know attorneys are sometimes shy about being vulnerable in front of others, and just know that this is a safe space. And I would love to hear from folks how that feels. Oops. Great. I hear from one person you feel comfortable. That's awesome. Another person contributing that in the moment it feels like focusing on the end goal or immediate needs to put everything else aside. And feeling like in hindsight, you're like, oh, I should have said that. I really feel that as somebody who is has spent time in courtrooms. I always Monday morning quarterback myself. Another aspect is another contribution in the chat is not feeling completely comfortable to put your main goal in jeopardy. I think that's really real. And I would really encourage you again to fold that practice into your hearing prep, because when I know that part of your hearing prep is probably practicing saying your argument out loud, and I would say, and sometimes you might put together a little book of mini briefing of different evidence objections that you anticipate coming up, and I would encourage you to include objections around some of these sort of pinch points that we're talking about, and include that as part of your mooting with your hearing preparation, and as part of your and encourage your colleagues to sort of fire those questions at you too. I know you probably do mooting with your colleagues. I remember that well, and I would just prep folks to ask those questions. Good point about express and obvious issues like misgendering when you have been specific in pleadings is easier to address than racial bias that may be subtler. And I would be interested to know from folks kind of how you might navigate that. And I think that that's an area of practice. I will tell you, I don't have a nice, clean answer for that. There's no rule book for these things. It's really, I know as attorneys, we really like rules. I would encourage us to think about how we might sort of think, again, it goes back to that practice of recognition and just getting familiar with experiences and hearing your clients. Your clients will often really tell you, like, I'm worried about this, I'm worried it will look like this. Because believe me, if you are representing a cutie BIPOC person, they know what racism looks like. They'll tell you. So before we close, I would like to ask folks, since we've had a lot of questions about sort of the legal process and what to do in courtrooms, I want to ask folks if you know whether your organizations have existing relationships with LGBTQ or cutie BIPOC community groups, and what your questions are about building those relationships. Because I can promise you that if you don't have those relationships, you're probably not getting folks in the door. It's not personal. Q Law Foundation is doing active work to engage with our communities too. We have to earn the trust of our communities. It is not automatic, because at the end of the day, we are a legal organization And lawyers have historically not been great tenders of our community's stories and our community's experiences.
Denise, I see another question. It says, I often do pro bono work with Spanish-speaking clients due to my language skills. Are there resources to assist with translations?
We have a webinar on working with interpreters that is available on our website. Our website's a little rusty. It's in the process of being updated. So I'll send it. I know who the questioner is. I'll send it to you directly. But it is, but I think that's always a question. And I think that the best possible resource is to work with interpreters who have experience with LGBTQ identities. There's a lot of terminology that comes up. And I think one option is to do, like, I keep coming back to like social media and media consumption, but honestly, like that's so much of where our community is sort of stuff is happening. And I think that there are good ways to learn LGBTQ inclusive language just by kind of watching folks in LGBTQ community spaces speak Spanish about their experiences. So one example is the use of the term Latinx and pronouns, gender neutral pronouns like ella instead of ella or ayo, or el, excuse me. I am not a Spanish speaker. That was a gigantic whiff. Ella and el, and then ella is a gender neutral pronoun, but it's not it's not like necessarily used by every single gender neutral Latino, Latina person. Some great organizations who are doing LGBTQ community work. WISN, the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, is very much weaving queer and trans experiences into their work. Entre Hermanos is a King County-based organization that specifically works with LGBTQ, Latino, Latina, Latine communities. And so I don't know that there's specific translation assistance, but there is a lot of overlap there. So we have about 1 minute left, and I would love to hear from someone who is either feeling committed to doing community building between your organization and QT BIPOC communities, or a reflection about what that community engagement might look like.
Before anyone responds real quick, I also wanted to note, recently we were told about Immigration Equality, which is the nation's leading LGBTQ immigrants' rights organization. And another group, they're part of the Transgender Law Center, is BLMP, which is the Black LGBTQ Migrant Project.
Thank you, Al. That's awesome. Great. Thank you for the comments about T-Mobile's outreach efforts and King County Bar Association. Really, really excited to have you all here in attendance. And we will have a follow-up email that includes all of these slides, as well as a recording of this presentation. We are so, so grateful that you joined us all here today. And we're just really honored by your engagement and your interest. Al, do you have any closing comments you wanna say?
This was fun. Thanks for joining. We were both shocked to see how many people were interested, but you know, it's always nice to know that folks are looking into doing the work, because we need more folks willing to do the work and focusing on community lawyering.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we will be in touch. Thanks. Bye, everybody.